Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Monday, everybody. I hope you had a restful weekend, and I wish you, as always, a very productive week ahead. We begin, as we usually do, with the economy. Over the weekend, Beijing hosted the Macroeconomic Forum at Renmin University in the capital. During the Saturday talks, Liu Shijin, former deputy director of the State Council's Development Research Center, delivered a concerning speech and warning on the state of China's economy. The former top government advisor urged Beijing to launch a stimulus package of at least 10 trillion yuan, $1.42 trillion US, within a year or so to prevent China from falling into a long-term spiral of deflation and stagnation. Liu told the audience that the stimulus should be primarily funded by ultra-long-term special bonds and should focus on addressing gaps in basic public services. Quote, "The stimulus plan should closely coordinate with demand-side structural reforms to create a combined effect of boosting consumption, stabilizing growth, and mitigating risks. This includes a stimulus scale of 10 trillion yuan. A key area is to significantly improve basic public services for new citizens, particularly rural migrant workers moving to cities, in areas like affordable housing, education, healthcare, social security, and elderly care." End quote. Regular viewers will recognize that this is the same advice that a growing chorus of economists and advisors have been calling for some time now, but also appreciate that a fiscally constrained and debt-laden Beijing is deeply hesitant to open the stimulus taps. Liu also suggested that the government buy unsold flats for conversion into preferential housing for rural migrant workers. We have heard this idea too, but once again, the issue of how local governments will pay for this is relevant. Liu remains optimistic, however. Whether this is heartfelt or just being politically correct, it's hard to know. He says that China is still at a, quote, medium-speed growth, end quote, where the importance of macroeconomic policy lies in maintaining stability and balance in the economic process. Meanwhile, today at the International Business Leaders Advisory Council in Shanghai, one of the world's top advertising executives, S4 Capital Executive Chairman Sir Martin Sorrell, said that China's central government should unleash more stimulus through added fiscal spending or more aggressive easing of interest rates. He warned that spending patterns of Chinese consumers have fundamentally changed. Next up for the economy. Today, China announced plans for a rare briefing on the economy by 3 top financial regulators, just as it cut one of its short-term policy rates. Fueling speculation, authorities are preparing to ramp up efforts to revive growth. Authorities announced Monday today that Central Bank Governor Pan Gongsheng will hold a press conference tomorrow on financial support for economic development. Just a few minutes later, the People's Bank of China, China's central bank, lowered the 14-day reserve repurchase rate. As UK-based The Financial Times explains, quote, "Taken together, the moves bolster expectations for the People's Bank of China to lower rates after the US Federal Reserve finally started cutting last week. China's central bank also recently signaled it was preparing additional policies. A slew of disappointing data in August raised concerns that China could miss its annual growth target of around 5% without more support." End quote. Zhang Zhiwei, president and chief economist at Pinpoint Asset Management, expressed today, quote, "I do expect the People's Bank of China will cut 7-day repo rates as well as the reserve requirement ratio in the coming months. There is a press conference tomorrow when the financial regulators will shed light on their policy stance." End quote. Raymond Young, chief Greater China economist at ANZ Bank, expressed, quote, "A 10 basis point cut alone is not sufficient to arrest the falling economic momentum. A bigger package is needed. Other policy measures in the toolbox, such as a RRR cut, MLF cut, and mortgage rate cut, will likely be announced." End quote. Hong Kong stocks rose modestly to the highest level in 3 months after the central bank cut. bolstering the argument that lower interest rates in the US will leave Beijing with more room for policy easing. Next up, I am in Kuala Lumpur this week, as many of you already know, so I decided to take this opportunity to do a deep dive and discuss the 33 million person strong Southeast Asian country's relations with China. There are lots of interesting dynamics within this relationship, the economic, security and diplomatic features of which we will now unpack. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to hit the like button. Sharing, liking and subscribing is a big help for the channel. It's the only way in which the channel can grow, and if you subscribe and hit the bell notification icon, you'll be on top of the most up-to-date analysis on China as it's released every day. Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are also in the description for those who want to help keep the channel financially sustainable. Now with that said, let's move to the second half of today's video. The Malaysian King, Sultan Ibrahim, just concluded a 4-day state visit to China, which he said aimed to further strengthen friendship and bilateral relations between the two countries. Malaysia has a Westminster-style constitutional monarchy, part of its British colonial heritage, where most power resides in the Prime Minister and the Parliament, and where the King enjoys strong symbolic significance and some political influence. Sultan Ibrahim said many topics he discussed with General Secretary Xi Jinping and Premier Li Qiang were well received by both leaders, telling Malaysian media, quote, "The good relationship between Malaysia and China is based on trust and respect, which enables close cooperation in almost all sectors. I hope the government will examine the results of this visit and take appropriate measures in the areas discussed, including education, trade, investment, as well as transport and connectivity. The country has good examples for us to follow in the effort to restore Malaysia after the last few challenging years." End quote. This is the King's first visit to the PRC after ascending the throne as the 17th King of Malaysia on the 31st of January at Xi Jinping's invitation. He also invited Xi to visit Malaysia. Back in June, Premier Li Qiang visited Malaysia in conjunction with the 50th anniversary of China-Malaysia diplomatic ties. During the visit, Li had an audience with the King and Prime Minister. Both premiers attended the groundbreaking ceremony of the Gombak Integrated Terminal Station on the East Coast Rail Link, a signature of China's Belt and Road Initiative venture in Malaysia. The two sides signed multiple cooperation documents, including a new 5-year deal for economic and trade cooperation. At the time, Li described China-Malaysian relations as, quote, "a fine example of relations between the countries in the region," end quote. As non-resident scholar at Carnegie, China, Chung Chui-Kwok explained at the time, quote, "Li's remark was not entirely rhetorical. Malaysia has been China's valuable partner, whose importance has gone beyond bilateral ties at multiple critical junctures," end quote. However, there appears to be limits to this partnership. There were expectations that during Li's visit, China would announce extending visa exemptions for Malaysian tourists from 15 to 30 days, and bring in new major investments, but neither of these came through. Just before arriving in Malaysia, Li announced in Canberra that Australia would receive a pair of giant pandas. Some Malaysians were disappointed that a similar arrangement was not announced in Malaysia. As Kwok observes, quote, "While several members of the Malaysian elite dismissed such expectations as unrealistic or impatient, others felt that as China has grown stronger, it has increasingly treated periodically defiant nations such as Australia and Vietnam better than its long-standing and stable partners. In their eyes, China has taken for granted the goodwill and deference of friendly neighbors such as Malaysia," end quote. During the Li visit back in June, Malaysian analysts noticed something interesting in the joint statement released by the Chinese and Malaysian governments in relation to Taiwan. For the first time in such a statement, the word peaceful, that had appeared before the words national reunification or reunification in these documents, this time had been dropped. Malaysian observers who noted the missing word expressed unease and emphasized the need for the word peaceful to be included in future documents. One question of debate in recent years has been, is Kuala Lumpur moving closer into Beijing's orbit? While Malaysia has enjoyed an especially close relationship to Beijing for decades and has sought to leverage this relationship for economic and other benefits, nevertheless, the elites have sought to balance China with other major inter- and intra-regional players. It was not a coincidence that 1 week before Li Qiang's visit in June, the Prime Minister's office confirmed the request for a courtesy visit by the US ambassador to Malaysia. At the meeting on June 11th, Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim and the US envoy discussed trade and investment as well as people-to-people relations while affirming, quote, commitment to enhancing comprehensive cooperation to a higher level, end quote. In 2023, Malaysia and Japan elevated their bilateral relations to a comprehensive strategic partnership and signed the Official Security Assistance Grant Aid, thereby enabling Japan to provide monitoring and surveillance equipment to Malaysia. In February 2024, the two countries conducted bilateral joint exercises, their first since they signed the 2018 Bilateral Defence Memorandum of Understanding. Less than 2 months later, in April 2024, the Royal Malaysian Navy and the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force conducted a 2-phase joint exercise around Kota Kinabalu port, marking their first joint exercise in the South China Sea. Niao Chaobing, non-resident scholar at Carnegie, China, observed in August that Malaysia's partnership with South Korea is moving in a similar direction, adding, quote, it is also partnering with European Union's Global Gateway, an infrastructure cooperation initiative, presumably the EU alternative to China's Belt and Road Initiative. In sum, it is clear that Malaysia is not just dancing with China, end quote. On the issue of the South China Sea, unlike Vietnam and the Philippines, Malaysia, which has territorial disputes with Beijing and the waterway too, has opted to pursue a non-confrontational, non-military approach. Prime Minister Anwar earlier this year contrasted Malaysia's policy with that of the Philippines. Quote, we take a less aggressive way of diplomatic engagement, and we have been rather successful in that regard, end quote, adding that, quote, we have been relatively more successful because we are deemed and seemed to be really neutral in the engagement, end quote. Now, let's finish this part by looking at Malaysia's involvement in the Belt and Road, or economic interests generally with the Chinese, and we move back to the visit of Malaysia's king to Beijing over the last few days. US-based Bloomberg, citing unnamed sources, writes that the king sought funding from Chinese investors for a multi-billion-dollar high-speed rail project between his country and Singapore. King Ibrahim is looking for investment from a Chinese state-owned company, the People said. During the 4-day visit, the king's delegation included a representative of YTL Corp. The Malaysian company is one of 3 groups shortlisted to develop the project. The king has been a long-time backer of the rail link, which Prime Minister Ibrahim's government revived last year with a caveat that it wouldn't be funded by taxpayers. Sultan Ibrahim told Singapore's Straits Times newspaper in December that a private consortium could fund it and operate it for 30 years to recoup expenses before handing it back to the Malaysian government. The country's Transport Minister, Anthony Loke, is part of the delegation to Beijing too. Back in July, he said the cabinet would decide on the project's viability by the end of the year. The rail line, which aims to cut travel time between the two cities to 90 minutes from more than 4 hours by car, was projected to cost as much as 100 billion ringgit, $23.8 billion, as a government-funded project. The project was formally cancelled in 2021 due to high costs, but like I just said, the current Anwar administration revived it last year. In an interview with Singapore-based Straits Times, King Ibrahim said the high-speed rail project should be aligned so that the border crossing into Singapore is through Forest City, a property development in Johor. The $100 billion development near its border with Singapore has become one of the symbols of China's property boom and bust. Forest City was built a decade ago as an eco-friendly hub comprising 4 artificial islands to attract 700,000 residents. But the project has been beset by challenges, including a clampdown by China's government on citizens seeking to purchase real estate abroad. COVID, political controversy, and Country Garden's financial woes, which have been well documented on this channel, added to the megacity's troubles. This week, Malaysia offered 0% tax rate benefits for family offices to set up shop there as it looks to revive investor interest in the development. The $100 billion project is operated by a joint venture between troubled Chinese developer Country Garden Holdings Co. and a Malaysian firm owned by King Ibrahim. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. Have a good Monday, and I will see you back for another new episode tomorrow.